Hello everyone, Jim Page here for Fly Fishing for the Rest of Us. So today we're going to talk about tides. Tides are critically important in your saltwater fishing, whether it's conventional or fly. That's almost a Captain Obvious statement, but there's a great variation of tides along the east coast of our country when you look at Maine all the way down through the Keys. And there's also not as much variation on the Gulf of Mexico, but there is some variation. And usually, in a general sense, locations either have one tide a day, being one low tide, one high tide a day, or two tides a day, two low tides and two high tides a day. Depends on location, and it's very important to know these tides. And fortunately for us, in the modern age, you can go on to the internet and find tides, the tidal information for just about any location along the east coast of the United States and through the Gulf of Mexico. NOAA has a good website. Safe Harbors has a good website. Those are probably the two I use the most. Tides for Fishing is another good website. And they'll tell you pretty specifically, NOAA not as much, but the other ones will tell you pretty specifically where you're going to fish, what your tides are going to be. So let's talk about the East Coast a little bit. So it's very interesting when you look at the East Coast. Some of the biggest tidal areas are basically from Boston up through Maine, and they have tides that are 8 to 12 feet. And then down at the end of the South Atlantic Bight, down here, Brunswick through Savannah, the Brunswick area has tides that are 5 to 10 feet. And now this is not taking into account a strong northeast wind, that you would see a northeast wind would blow more water into these areas. An east wind would blow more waters into these areas. Full moons and new moons increase the tidal flow in these areas. In Boston's the same way. An east wind or northeast wind would blow more water into the Boston area. Maine coast is the same. A big nor'easter or a big east wind and somewhat of a southeast wind would blow more water in. So your tide might be stated at 9 feet, but with a lot of wind, a 35, 40 mile an hour wind, you might end up with 2 extra or 3 extra foot of water in there or more. When you get north of Savannah, Georgia, Savannah having about 7 foot tides at the max. From Savannah, Georgia, up through Boston, your tidal range on the Atlantic coastline, gets a little more generic. Your high tides range in the 4 to 7 feet range, just about from Savannah all the way up to Boston. You got a 4 to 7 foot high tide. And most of these places have 2 tides a day. When you go south out of Brunswick, St. Mary's area, down the east coast of Florida, you get back into the more 4 to 6 foot tidal range all the way down. And that includes the Keys. You know, the Keys, you might have only a 4 foot tidal range. Now, the Gulf of Mexico, when you look at the Texas coast, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida Panhandle, the Big Bend area of Florida, down through Tampa, that whole Gulf of Mexico, the tidal range really doesn't change that much. Your high tide tidal ranges is 1 to 4 feet. Just about anywhere you go in this area, the biggest tide you'll get is about a 4 foot tide. The smallest one is under a foot tide. And so the tidal influx here does not impact the fishing, does not impact the fishing as much as it does this area with a 9 foot tide, or up in Massachusetts where you have a 9 or 10 foot tide, or Maine where you have a 10, 11, 12 foot tide. You need water moving, but there's not enough water necessarily to reposition fish. So let's talk a little bit about fishing the tides. Personally, I prefer a low incoming tide, whether I'm fishing the Gulf of Mexico or if I'm fishing the Atlantic East Coast of the United States, Florida included. When I say East Coast, I'm talking Boston, Maine, all the way down to the Keys. I prefer a low incoming tide. In areas where you have a big tide, say a high tide could be 9 to 12 feet, it's a lot easier to pull a boat out of the water at the top of that tide than at the bottom of the tide. Some places, the bottom of the tide, there won't even be a boat ramp left for you to pull in. And some places with big tides, they don't even have boat ramps, they have boat lifts. It's much easier to walk up a dock from a floating dock from boat lift at a high tide when the ramp is like this versus a low tide when the ramp is like this. Now, in the Gulf of Mexico, because they don't have the big tidal changes, it's basically 1 to 4 feet, you don't have that concern. But I still like to fish the low incoming tides. Now, we go back to say that, this channel is about everyone who fly fishes or is getting into fly fishing, has a job, they have family, they have responsibilities, and you have to go fishing when you go fishing. Well, look at the tides, and maybe when you have a vacation, maybe plan your vacation around the tides a little bit if you have any flexibility. If your work says that, you can only take this time off because of whatever, the constraints of your job, then just go. And then when you get to wherever you're going, look at your tides. Tides, you can always catch fish on different stages of the tide. The fish will be in different locations. Like I said, my preference is a low tide coming in. You can see the topology, you can see the terrain that's going to be covered by the tide. You can take your boat out at the end of the day much easier. And on the Gulf Coast, in some of the places in the Keys where you're fishing flats, when that tide moves in, the predatory fish move in with the tide. Now, there's some flats along Florida that never go dry. There's some flats in the Keys that do go dry. Obviously, in the Bahamas the same way. Obviously, when you have a flat that goes dry, the fish aren't going to be there because there's no water, said Captain Obvious, right? But when you look at Florida, these flats associated with the bays, so you've got, and I'll spin this around. I'll spin the camera around at the end of the video and point some out. The flats in these bays, this would be Panama City Bay. Same over here, the bay by Eglin Air Force Base, Fort Walton, which is I can't even pronounce that, Choctawaatchee Bay. Those bays, a lot of the flats don't ever go dry. The flat will have a gentle slope off to deep water. So there'll be 1 to 4 feet more water on the flat, but it doesn't necessarily go dry all the way. So sometimes fish don't move off that flat, but if the flat does get too low, the fish will move off that flat and go into the deeper water. So in the Panhandle area where these flats don't go dry, you will have fish be there the whole tide cycle. At the bottom of the tide and at the top of the tide, when there's no water moving, the fish won't bite. And that goes really for the East Coast too. Dead low tide and dead high tide, you might catch a few fish, but you're not going to catch many. Those fish want that water to move. Now, in areas that have a big tide, the Georgia coast, Boston up, the tide is not one smooth, constant motion. It has stronger and lesser periods. And the lesser period of the incoming tide would be better than the stronger period of an incoming tide. Same with the outgoing tide. You guys from the Midwest and out west who trout fish, you all know that trout will not fight a current if they don't have to, right? They're going to sit downstream of a rock or an obstruction. They'll be up above it. Fish don't like to fight a current. Well, saltwater fish aren't really that much different in that aspect, that if they can get something hide behind something to break the current and have food brought to them, an oyster hump, a little dip, a little channel, they'll find something to break that current in areas that have a lot of current. And they also like the current to bring, make it as an ambush point. So when you have an area that has a big tide, the Georgia coast, and really some of the East Coast compared to the Gulf of Mexico, use that tide to your advantage. If you're fishing an outgoing tide, any of these little cuts or creeks that drain out into a larger body of water, especially if it has some deep water around there, on an incoming tide, those fish will go up those little cuts and creeks and look for bait, crabs, and other items. And then on an outcoming tide, especially if that area drains dry, they'll come out that little creek and position at the first thing that breaks the current and also has water through the low tide cycle. A little deep hole, the backside of an oyster bed. Oyster beds by a deep hole are great. Those fish will feed on the crabs and the shrimp around the oysters. They'll sit in that deep hole, and as fish wash out of the cut out of the marsh or bayous, they'll pick them off. So If you're on an incoming tide, those fish will be in that deep water when that tide starts moving in, and they'll follow that water in. They'll go up these little creeks and cuts looking for crabs and blue crabs, fiddler crabs, mud crabs on oysters. They'll look for mud minnows, munchamungs, mullet, finger mullet, uh, some fish, anything they can get in their mouth. So fish will move in with those water up the cuts and creeks, and they'll move out of those cuts and creeks when the tide goes out. Not that much different than a saltwater flat, say down in Florida, down in the Keys. You've got some flats that might have a little bit of water at dead low tide, but when that water moves in, those fish will push up on that flat and start looking for food. So that's another thing to consider. If you're on an outgoing tide and you just have to fish the outgoing tide, look for flats or shallow water that has some deeper water adjoining it. And don't be afraid as that tide drops out to the bottom to get out where that tide, the bottom breaks or the water changes depth, and fish that depth change. Fish out in that deeper hole or that deeper run. Not that much different than trout fishing in a river. You've got deep runs in the river that the fish will get in and hold and stage and wait for food to wash by. So there's some similarities there for you guys from traditional upper Midwest, and out west where they have some really great trout fishing. The one thing to think about with the tides and the weather on the East Coast, I'm going to say East Coast would be from Miami up to Boston. Time of day and weather don't necessarily dictate the fish bite. For example, if you've got a tidal area that has a 4 to 8 foot tide or a 4 to 12 foot tide, and it's in the middle of the summer, it's really hot. Well, when that tide starts moving in, that water gets more oxygenated and also brings in usually some cooler water with it. So you probably can still catch fish in the summer in areas with more tidal flow. When you compare that to the Gulf of Mexico, my experience has been, so when you get to the dog days, halfway through May, June, July, August, first half of September when it's really hot, in the Panhandle, Gulf of Mexico, in the morning, first light, and I'm talking about first light, I'm talking about 5 a.m. Central Time or Eastern Time. When that sun is just breaking and it's that light gray, from there to about 10 a.m. in the morning, the fish are going to feed. When it gets past 10 a.m., it slows down. I've seen it like clockwork more times than I can count on flats that I fished in the Panhandle wade fishing. Get out there first light, which means you got to get up about 4 a.m., get to the water, when it's just gray light, a little bit earlier if you want to. And when that sun gets up 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, temperature starts going up, fish shuts down. Now, this is for inshore. The interesting thing is the fish in the Gulf want moving water. So even if you only have a place that has a 1 foot tide, you want that water to be moving. If your max tide in an area can be 1.5 feet, any tide that's 1.5 or 1.5, or if the wind pushes it to 1.7, in the Gulf of Mexico, a bigger tide is better as a general rule of thumb. So if you have a place where the max tide is 1.5 feet and the minimum tide on the high tide is like a half a foot, pick a tide that's 1.5 feet to fish over a half foot, because you have moving water, more moving water and longer moving water, and it will open up more areas in the shallower water to fish to eat. So kind of a rule of thumb is, in the Gulf of Mexico, I prefer to go fish it on full moons and new moons. I'm not a big fan of full moons in the summer because I think fish feed more at night on a full moon in the summer on the bigger tide. A new moon, when there's not as much light, I think they'll feed more during the day. You can always fish at night if you have a boat during the summer. So when you have a new moon and full moon, I tend to do more of my fishing in the Gulf of Mexico because I have friends down there and I can drive down and fish with them. New moons and full moons on the East Coast, where my family lives, creates the biggest tides, which you can fish them. And in the summer, when the fiddler crabs come out of hibernation and they're way back in the marsh looking for food, those big tides in the summer will let all that what is usually dry ground have 1 to 3 foot of water on them, and those redfish will push way up in the marsh. Where in the winter, when the tides aren't as big and the fiddler crabs are hibernating, those redfish won't push way up in the marsh like that. They'll stay out in the deeper water. So on a full moon and a new moon, if I can go to the Gulf of Mexico, I do. If I can't get to the Gulf of Mexico and it's the summer warmer months when the fiddler crabs are out, then I'll look to go way back in the marsh at the top of the high tide and then get out of there quickly, because when you have a 9-foot tide in the southeast or a 7-foot tide, you might have 3 or 4 foot of water at the high tide, but when that water starts moving out, it moves out quickly, and then you'll be stuck in mud if you don't get out of there quick, and you have to wait for the next high tide to float your boat out. So get up there, fish quickly, get your fish. When that water starts dropping off, get out of there, get back out into the deeper water so you don't get stuck. And that goes back to I have to fish when I can, where I can. So if you have an East Coast trip on a new moon or full moon, especially if you can afford a guide, think about fishing way up in the marsh, flood tides in the marsh for reds tailing on fiddler crabs. If it's not in the summer months, if it's fall, winter, spring, those fish will be out, and they'll be out in the deeper water, and you can catch them on intermediate and sinking lines on that deeper water on a falling tide in the first part of an incoming tide. And they'll move some looking for food, but they won't move as far as they do in the summer. So tides that are not times of the month that are not high tides and low tide, full moons and new moons, I usually head to the East Coast and fish East Coast. If I know there's going to be a full moon or a new moon, I try not to go to the East Coast. I try to go to the Gulf of Mexico. And then in the summer, in the Gulf of Mexico, I do think the heat has an impact on those fish, because there's not that much water moving. The water doesn't cool off as much. That water gets really warm in the summer. So in the summer in the Gulf of Mexico, I'm fishing first thing in the morning, right at sunlight. I'm putting my rod together, getting ready to fish when the sun's coming up, which means if you're going for a boat ride, you're launching before dark, you're running your boat so that wherever you want to fish, you're there when the sun starts breaking the horizon and you get that kind of gray light to you. You're there fishing. And then at 10 or 11 o'clock, you might come off the water. Makes it kind of nice if you're on a family vacation. Everyone's asleep back at wherever you're staying. You can get out there if you're in an area that's suitable for wade fishing, which you see more, to me, that's more in the panhandle of Florida than the east coast of Florida and the southwest coast of Florida. Or if you have a kayak, pretty much you can fish anywhere with a kayak. You can get out there early at 5 a.m. when everybody else is sleeping, fish till 9 or 10, then go back and meet everybody for breakfast, for a late breakfast, and then go to the beach all day. I will say that the beaches of Florida, you can fish those as long as you have moving water. You can fish those East Coast, West Coast, doesn't matter. You can fish those any time of the day. They're not as time dependent. Even in the summer, when it's warm, they don't shut down like the inshore does, because there's surf, there's tide, the water's being constantly aerated. When you have an incoming tide, it's bringing in that cooler water from the ocean. So you can fish beaches all day. You don't have to be worried about time of day on the beaches. So kind of summarize what we talked about so far. Tides are very important. The Gulf of Mexico has much smaller tides than the Atlantic coast, obvious, 1 to 4 feet from Texas down through the Keys. The east coast of our country, south of Jacksonville, you have more smaller tides, say 4 to 7 feet. From Jacksonville north up through Savannah, Beaufort, you've got some pretty large tides, up to 10 feet. That's without any kind of wind impact on the tide. When you get Beaufort area, when you get Charleston up through Boston, the tides are pretty much that 2 to 7 foot range. They're a lot more manageable. And then Boston up through Maine, those are big tides, 10, 12 feet. Those tides will hurt you. They're very dangerous. If you get caught in a bad place, I will tell you one story from when I grew up in Brunswick. My father was a member of a dive club, so any boating incidents or anyone who got lost, it always came up at the dive club discussions. and there was 4 guys fishing one of the outer sandbars, probably 5 miles off the coast of Georgia. Georgia has a series of sandbars where I grew up, and they were all in one of the outer sandbars. And there was 4 guys, center console, all 4 men got out of the boat, anchored the boat, threw the anchor out on the boat, and it was an incoming tide. They're out shark fishing. Well, the tide kept coming up like it does. And I don't know if they short anchored, the anchor had too short of a line on it. I don't know if it didn't have a good set. But the boat broke free and started drifting away. And it was a center console boat, so it had the wind pushing it and the tide carrying it. And we're talking probably 7-8 foot of tide. 2 of the guys took off swimming after the boat. 2 of the guys stood on the sandbar, and I don't know how much water was on the sandbar when the broke free. If they actually anchored it, on top of the sandbar, just off the sandbar. I don't know exactly what they did, and I was very young when this happened. I was probably 8 or 9. 2 of the guys took off after the boat. 2 guys stayed on the sandbar. The 2 guys who took out after the boat, they both drowned. They never found them. The 2 guys on the sandbar stayed on the sandbar as long as they could. But, if you have a tide that's 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 feet, you're not staying on that sandbar till the next low tide. If it was a 4-foot tide, you might be able to, hold your position and stay on that sandbar through the tide cycle. So one of the guys took his pants off and did the whole tie the legs, throw the pants over, use it as a life jacket. And the other guy had shorts on, but a long sleeve shirt, and he did the same thing. Took his shirt off, tied the sleeves, and used it as a life jacket. And they floated overnight that way, from late afternoon overnight. And the Coast Guard found those 2 guys. It was just, I guess it wasn't their time. But we did lose 2 guys, and it was a combination of big tides. They all got out of the boat, which is a mistake, and the wind. And a big boat, center console, you cannot swim that boat down. I don't care who you are. That wind catches that boat and that tide catches that boat, you're not catching it. You're not swimming it down. So, lesson learned. That stuck with me when I was young because my dad and I talked about it. Because we had a little boat and we talked out. And my dad was very adamant about, don't do these things in the boat because it could kill you. The one thing too is the Gulf of Mexico can be a little deceiving. I do want to touch on this. So, several places in the Gulf of Mexico and the east coast of the Atlantic, there's what they call passes. It's basically an inlet from a large bay out into the Gulf or the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see here, if I hadn't closed it, you could see the Panama City Pass and how much water it drains out behind. You can see how much water is behind that pass. That pass is a man-made pass. It's very narrow. And you can see, sorry for the glare, you can see how narrow that pass is. You can see all that water behind it. Now, Panama City has very small tides. A big tide might be 2 feet, 2.5 feet. That's a big tide. But that volume of water going in and out that little tiny pass, that water rips through that pass. Rips through it, just like it would somewhere up in Maine. If you're fishing the rocks along that pass with a sinking line and you fall in on an outgoing tide, you cannot outswim that tide. So if you fall in fishing along the jetties, the rocks, just like you would in the Northeast, off the coast of Delaware, Jersey, you're going to be sucked right out into the Atlantic. If you don't get run over by a boat, because all the boats go in and out of this pass from the bay to the ocean, if you don't get run over by a boat or eaten by a shark, hopefully you get picked up by the Coast Guard if someone calls it in. So don't be deceived that these areas that only have a foot of tide and the tide barely moves and you can go wade fish it and it's no big deal. But you'll see there's a pass here. The tide rips through that pass. You'll see here there's a bridge. There's a choke point here. And even though that tide moves slow, when it goes through this little choke point right here where there's another bridge, it runs really hard through that. And if you get caught in that, you got to drift out and then swim through the other side. You cannot swim against it. Boats use these passes. You'll see St. Andrew Sound, the next one. There's a pass here. The tide runs very hard through that. Boats use these passes, and so do sharks. And there's big sharks in the Panhandle. And we talked about that before. You'll see here, down toward Apalachicola and Port St. Joe, there's a little tiny pass here, and you see that big old bay behind it. When that water starts running out, it runs out. It moves fast. There's Boca Grande Pass in Southwest Florida. It's the same way. It's a very well-known pass, big tarpon fishery, big hammerheads. The water flies out of Boca Grande Pass. On the East Coast, you got the Jupiter Inlet. It's the same way. You've got Haulover Canal in Miami. It's the same way. Jupiter's real dangerous. A couple of these passes have a bunch of chunk rock on the bottom, and on an outgoing tide, they get standing waves like whitewater rivers. And these standing waves will be, 6 feet tall, 8 feet tall. And you hit that in a boat, you got a bad day. And then if you got wind pushing against it, so you got an east wind but an outgoing tide, you got standing waves created by the bottom structure, you have a mess. So don't let these areas that have low tidal flow fool you that when it goes through a pass or if it's narrowed down under a bridge, that current goes very fast and you can't swim against it. You just have to go where it takes you and then hopefully get to shore. The same for the Everglades National Park. That area down there doesn't have a tremendous amount of tidal flow per se, but a lot of the places you can see it's just 10,000 islands. The 10,000 islands area, there's all these little nooks and crannies and these little cuts between islands. You get in that area in a kayak, when that tide starts running out, it runs hard. I mean, it just does. So be advised that anywhere like this, you could get caught in a current that just runs you out to the big open water. Which if you're in a kayak, it's not a problem, but if you're wade fishing and you slip in the wrong spot and you go for a ride, free ride, it's not good. And I will tell you, when you get to the lower Keys, Marathon Key down in Key West, you've got the Gulf meeting the Atlantic. The tides down there get pretty complex and the impact on fishery gets pretty complex. So it's really best to hire a guide down. On the upper Keys, say Key Largo, Tavernier, the tides aren't as complex because there's more land mass there between the Gulf of Mexico. You got Florida Bay there. You got more land mass between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic, so the tides are a little more normal, more predictable. But in the lower Keys, I definitely would recommend a guide because the tides are complex and the bottom's complex and it's hard to figure out. It's a tough place to fish. I do want to say one other thing about tides and how important they are to feeding fish. We already talked about, I prefer low tides on a full moon or new moon when the tides are bigger. I prefer the Gulf of Mexico over the Atlantic. In the summertime, you can fish the big tides for the tailing reds up in the Spartina grass chasing fiddler crabs. We talked about that fish tend to move in with water as the tide moves in, whether it's up creeks or on flats, and then they tend to move out. If you're going to Hawaii to fish for bonefish on Oahu or Molokai, you need to have an incoming tide. That's all there is to it. There's not even a debate about that. I've fished there several times on business and had to go and fish when I could, and the tide was going out, and you could see where the bonefish had come in and fed at night, the night before on the incoming tide, and then on the outgoing tide, they got off the flats. They all left. And it was very distinct, the blowholes where the bonefish had been feeding. And we got to one flat, it was the tide was going out, and there was one bonefish trailing off the flat, going out to deep water. It's a pancake flat. So really, if you're going to go to the Hawaiian Islands on vacation and you can schedule it and you do want to do some bone fishing, try to get an incoming tide during the day. Critical. It's critical out there. If you're like me and you're on business and you had to go when you can go, it's going to be tough. You're really going to have to hunt and peck, and you're probably going to need to get a guide because that outgoing tide is a tough place to fish for bonefish because those bonefish do get off the flat. So that's kind of my overview for tides. They are important. They are dangerous. They can kill you. They can be your best friend. They can help you. They can be your worst enemy. It's good to know what your tides are doing. And if you, like I said, if you just have to go fishing when you go fishing, then kind of plan out what you can do and fish where you can, and just be careful. So that's it. If you have any questions, leave me a comment. I will leave those tide links in the description below, down there. The NOAA website and the other website, I'll leave those for you in the description. And keep your hooks sharp and tight lines.